Welcome back to a Book a Day podcast. We have spent a good deal of the last few episodes on Tao Te Ching, Sun Tzu's text on Taoism. And yet I feel it's not really enough if we really want to understand the ancient Chinese philosophy, especially Taoism. And therefore, I would like to explore a couple of more books with you and make sure that we understand the ideas in really simple terms. And that's why I've picked another book on Taoism. It's called What is Tao, written by Alan Watts. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of episodes is going to read these two sections from the book. In part 1, we focus on the fundamentals of Taoism, but in part 2, we talk about all kinds of different practices and philosophies that emerge out of these ideas. So, in today's episode, I'm going to read this first section for you, and I hope you'll get to learn a lot of things from the text. So let me start reading. These are really small chapters. There are a few chapters, but I'm sure you'll understand them. The language is really simple, and it just makes it so simple to understand what Taoism is. It starts with this chapter on Taoism and Confucianism. And let me start reading it for you, and you will get an idea what these two are all about. So here we go. Taoism and Confucianism. There are two great main currents in traditional Chinese thinking: the Taoist current and the Confucian. Both of them agree on one fundamental principle, and that is that the natural world in which we live and human nature itself must be trusted. They would say of a person who cannot trust his own basic nature, if you cannot trust your own nature, how can you trust your own mistrusting of it? How do you know that your mistrust is not wrong as well? If you do not trust your own nature, you become as tangled up as anyone can be. Their idea of nature is that which happens of itself. And that is a process which is not fundamentally under our control. By definition, it is that which is happening all on its own, just as breathing is happening all on its own, and just as our heart is beating all on its own. And the fundamental wisdom behind Taoist philosophy is that this self-so process is to be trusted. Taoist thought is generally attributed to Lao Tzu, who is thought to have lived somewhere around 400 BCE, and to Chuang-Tzu, who lived from 369 to 286 BCE. Taoism is known to us as the uniquely Chinese way of thought, living, and liberation, although its roots certainly lie in shamanic traditions common to much of Northeastern Asia and probably to North America as well. In its final form, however, it is so similar to Buddhism that Taoist terms are often used to translate Sanskrit texts to Chinese. Once Buddhism was imported to China, Taoism so completely permeated Mahayana Buddhism in general and Zen Buddhism in particular that the philosophies of these schools are often indistinguishable. Like Vedanta and yoga in India, older gentlemen in China traditionally adopted Taoism after they had made their contribution to society. And thereafter they would retire to primitive dwellings or caves to live in the wild and meditate for long periods of time. As in Buddhist lore, where the return of the sage into the world is known as the path of the Bodhisattva. Taoist stories are filled with accounts of the return of the liberated sage into worldly affairs. In fact, the primary text, the Tao Te Ching, was originally written as a manual of advice for the ruling class. The teachings of Lao Tzu and of Chuang Tse must not be confused, incidentally, with the Taoist cult of alchemy and magic preoccupied with life extension that is Taoist only in name and not in practice. Although Taoism proper has never become an organized religion, it has attracted the curiosity of scholars and philosophers of the Far East for more than 2000 years. Taoism regards the entire natural world as the operation of the Tao, a process that defies intellectual comprehension. The experience of the Tao cannot be obtained through any preordained method, although those who seek it often cultivate inner calm through the silent contemplation of nature. Taoists understand the practice of Wu Wei, the attribute of not forcing or grasping, and recognize that human nature, like all nature, is of itself so. It's called Zhu Jan. When we look at Confucian ideas which govern Chinese moral and social life, we find a different world that represents the basis of human nature. The word has a funny pronunciation, and although we romanize this word in English as Jen, it is pronounced Ren with a sort of rolling R, Ren. This word is symbolic of mankind's cardinal virtue in the system of Confucian morality, and it is usually translated human-heartedness or humanness. When Confucius was asked to give a precise definition of it, though he refused, he said, "You have to feel the meaning of this virtue. You must never put it into words." The wisdom of his attitude towards defining Jen or Ren is simply that a human being is always greater than anything they can say about themselves and anything they can think about themselves. If we formulate ideas about our own nature, about our own minds and emotions, those ideas are always going to be qualitatively inferior. That is to say, far less complicated and far less alive than the actual author of the ideas themselves, and that is us. So there is something about ourselves that we can never get at, that we can never define. And in just the same way you cannot bite your own teeth, you cannot hear your own ears, and you cannot make your hand catch hold of itself. So therefore, you must let go and trust the goings on of your humanness. Confucius was the first to say that he would rather trust human passions and instincts than trust human ideas about what is right. For like the Taoists, he realized that we have to allow all living things to look after themselves. The world and its opposites. When we say that things are, we always contrast them with something else. And when we try to talk about the whole universe, about all that there is, we find we really have no words for it. It is one what. All of this one what is represented by the symbol of the great circle. But in order to think about life, we have to make comparisons. And so we split it in two and derive from the circle the symbol of the yang and the yin, the positive and the negative. We see this symbol over and over on Chinese pottery and today on everything from jewelry to t-shirts. Traditionally, this emblem is one of the basic symbols of the philosophy of Taoism. It is the symbol of the yang or the male, and the yin, the feminine, the female, of the positive and the negative, the yes and the no, the light and the dark. We always have to divide the world into opposites or categories in order to be able to think about it. In the words of Lao Tzu, when people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Tao. In Lao Tzu's philosophy, the unity is called Tao. Although it is written Tao in Chinese, it is pronounced almost as if it were spelled DOW rather than TAO. It has the sense of a rhythmic motion, of going on and stopping, and also a sense of intelligence. And so you get an idea of a sort of rhythmic intelligence that ebbs and flows like the tides. The word has two general meanings. One is perhaps best rendered into English as the way of things or the way of nature. The other sense of the word means to speak. So when the opening words of Lao Tzu's book say, the Tao cannot be spoken, is not, rather the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. It makes a pun in Chinese. It says literally, the Tao that can be Tao is not Tao. Or if you read it like a telegram, Tao can Tao, no Tao. The first meaning of Tao is the way, and the second meaning of it is to speak, or in other words, the way that can be expressed is not the eternal way. I prefer not to translate the word Tao at all because to us Tao is a sort of nonsense syllable indicating the mystery that we can never understand, the unity that underlies the opposites. In our deepest intuition, we know that there is some sort of unity underlying these various opposites because we find that we cannot separate one from the other. We know that a whole universe exists, but we can't really say what it is. So Tao is thus a reality that we apprehend deeply without being able to define it. A Chinese poet put it this way: plucking chrysanthemums along the eastern fence, gazing in silence at the southern hills, the birds fly home in pairs. Through the soft mountain air of dusk. In all these things there is a deep meaning, but when we are about to express it, we suddenly forget the words. Lao Tzu also said, "Those who speak do not know, those who know do not speak." And another Chinese poet satirized him by saying, "Those who speak do not know, those who know do not speak." Thus we have heard from Lao Tzu, and yet how does it come that he himself wrote a book of 500 characters? The point then is that his whole book does not in any way define what the Tao means. He speaks not so much about it, but rather speaks with it, using it, as it were, as the power by which to express himself. So what is the reason why Tao is inexpressible and yet at the same time the basis for a philosophy? The reason is that we cannot have any system of thought, whether it be philosophical or logical or mathematical or physical, which defines its own basis. This is an extremely important principle to understand. In other words, I can pick up a paintbrush with my right hand, but I cannot pick up my right hand. My right hand picks itself up. If I try to pick up my hand, what would I pick it up with? There always has to be something, as it were, that is not picked up, that picks itself up, that works itself and is not worked upon. In the same way, you will find that if you look up to be in a dictionary, it is defined as to exist. Then, when you look up to exist, you will find it defined as to be. And are you any the wiser? A dictionary cannot really define itself. Ultimately, it can only put words together that correspond to other words. In this sense, to try to say anything about the Tao is like trying to eat your own mouth, and of course, you cannot get outside of it to eat it. Or to put it the other way, anything you can chew is not your mouth. Anything that is expressed about the Tao is not the Tao. Zhu Jan, or by itself so. There's always something that we don't know. This is well illustrated by the elusive qualities of energy in physics. We cannot really define energy, but we can work with it. And this is the case with the Tao. The Tao works by itself. Its nature is to be, as is said in Chinese, Zhu Jan. That which is of itself, by itself, or itself so. Zhu Jan is almost what we mean when we say that something is automatic, or that something happens automatically. We sometimes translate this expression in English as nature, as when we talk about the nature of the mountains, the birds, the bees, and the flowers. That sort of nature in Chinese would be Zhu Jan. The fundamental sense of it is that the Tao operates of itself. All that is natural operates of itself, and there is nothing standing over it and making it goon. In the same way, one's own body operates of itself. You don't have to decide when and how you're going to beat your heart. It just happens. You don't decide exactly how you're going to breathe. Your lungs fill and empty themselves without effort. You don't determine the structure of your own nervous system or your bones. They grow all by themselves. So the Tao goes along of itself. And since there is always a basic element of life that cannot be defined, in the same way the Tao cannot be defined, it cannot be controlled. In other words, you can't get outside yourself to define yourself or to control yourself. Lao Tzu would go on to say that since man is an integral part of the nature or natural universe, he cannot hope to control it as if it were an object quite separate from himself. You can't get outside of nature to be the master of nature. Remember that your heart beats self-so, and if you give it a chance, your mind can function self-so, although most of us are afraid to give it a chance. Wu Wei, or not forcing. Whenever we have the feeling of being able to dominate ourselves, master ourselves, or become the lords of our nature, what happens is that we do not really succeed in getting outside of nature or of ourselves at all. Instead, we have forced our way of seeing these things to conform to an illusion that makes us think they are controlled objects. And in doing this, we invariably set up a conflict inside the system. We soon find that the tension between our idea of things and things as they are puts us out of accord with the way of things. For this reason, you might say that not forcing is the second principle of the Tao. The spontaneous or of itself, the so activity Zhu Jan being the first. In Chinese, the second principle is called Wu Wei, and it means literally not doing, but would be much better translated to give it the spirit of not forcing or not obstructing. In reference to the Tao, it is the sense that the activity of nature is not self-obstructive. It all works together as a unity and does not, as it were, split apart from itself to do something to itself. Wu Wei is also applied to human activity and refers to a person who does not get in his or her own way. One does not stand in one's own light while working, and so the way of Wu Wei is the way of non-obstruction or non-interference. This is the preeminently practical Taoist principle of life. What I mean by forcing yourself is something like this. When children in school are supposed to be paying attention to the teacher, their thoughts will go wandering all over the place. And the teacher will soon get angry and say, "Pay attention." And the children will wrap their legs around the legs of the chair and they will stare at the teacher and try to look frightfully intelligent. But what happens was expressed very well in a cartoon I saw the other day. A small boy is standing and looking at his teacher and saying, "I'm so sorry, I didn't hear what you were saying because I was listening so hard." In other words, when we try to be loving or to be virtuous or to be sincere, we actually think about trying to do it in the same way the child was trying to listen, tightening up his muscles and trying to look intelligent as he thought about paying attention. But he wasn't thinking about what the teacher is saying, and therefore he wasn't really listening at all. This is a perfect example of what is meant by blocking yourself or getting in your own light. To offer another illustration of it, suppose you're cutting wood. If you go against the way the tree grew, that is to say against the grain of the wood is very difficult to cut. If you go with the grain, however, it splits easily. Or again, in sawing wood, some people are in a great hurry to get on with sawing and they try and power right through the piece. But what happens? When you try the board over, you see the back edge of the board is full of splinters and you find that you are rather tired as well. Any skilled carpenter will tell you, let the saw do the work. Let the teeth do the cutting. And you find that by going at it quite easily and just allowing the blade to glide back and forth, the wood is easily cut. As our own proverb says, easy does it. And Wu Wei means easy does it. Look out for the grain of things, the way of things, move in accord with it, and work is thereby made simple. And finally, this small chapter on Te, or translated as virtue, skill at living. In one book, the philosopher Chuang-Tze tells a wonderful story about a butcher who was able to keep the same chopper for 20 years because he was always careful to let the blade fall on the interstices between the bones. And so in this way, he never wore it out. Once again, we see that the person who learns the kind of activity which is, shall we say, in accord with the Tao, is said to possess virtue. This peculiar Chinese sense of virtue is called Te. But what is not virtue in quite our ordinary sense of being good? Te is like our word virtue when it is used more in the sense of the healing virtues of a plant. When we use the word virtue in this way, it really designates an extraordinary kind of skill at living. And in his book, Lao Tzu says the superior kind of virtue is not conscious of itself as virtue, and thus really is virtue. But the inferior kind of virtue is so anxious to be virtuous that it loses its virtue altogether. We often come upon the kind of virtuous person who is self-consciously virtuous, who has, you might say, too much virtue. These are the sorts of people who are a perpetual challenge to all their friends. And when you are in their presence, you feel they are so good that you don't know quite what to say. And so you are always, as it were, sitting on the edge of your chair and feeling a little bit uncomfortable in their presence. In a Taoist way of speaking, this kind of person stinks of virtue and doesn't really have any virtue at all. The truly virtuous person is unobtrusive. It is not that they are affectedly modest, instead, they are what they are quite naturally. Lao Tzu says that the greatest intelligence appears to be stupidity. The greatest eloquence sounds like a stammer, and the greatest brightness appears as if it were dull. And of course, this is a kind of paradoxical way of saying that true virtue, te, is the living of human life in such a fashion as not to get in its own way. This is the thing we all admire and envy so much about children. We say that they are naive, that they are unspoiled, that they are artless, and that they are unself-conscious. When you see a little child dancing who has not yet learned to dance before an audience, you can see the child dancing all by itself. And there is a kind of completeness and genuine integrity to their motion. When the child then sees that parents or teachers are watching and learns that they may approve or disapprove, the child begins to watch itself while dancing. All at once, the dancing becomes stiff and then becomes artful or worse, artificial, and the spirit of the child's dance is lost. But if the child happens to go on studying dance, it is only after years and years that, as an accomplished artist, the dancer regains the naivete and the naturalness of their original dance. But when the naturalness is regained, it is not just the simple, we could say embryonic naturalness of the child, completely uncultivated and untutored. Instead, it is a new kind of naturalness that takes into itself and carries with itself years and years of technique, know-how, and experience. In all this, you will see that there are three stages. There is first what we might call the natural or the childlike stage of life in which self-consciousness has not yet arisen. Then there comes the middle stage, which we might call as one's awkward age, in which one learns to become self-conscious. And finally, the two are integrated in the rediscovered innocence of a liberated person. Of course, there's a tremendous advantage in this, because one must ask, if you are enjoying life without knowing that you are enjoying it, are you really enjoying it? And here, of course, consciousness offers an enormous advantage. But there's also a disadvantage, even a danger in developing it, because as consciousness grows and as we begin to know how to look at ourselves and beyond ourselves, we may start over and over again and cause much interference with ourselves. This is when we begin to get in our own light. You know how it is when you get in your own light or get in your own way, when it becomes desperately essential that you hurry to catch a train or plane, for example, instead of your muscles being relaxed and ready to run, your anxiety about not getting there in time immediately stifles you up and you start stumbling over everything. It is the same sort of thing on those days when everything goes absolutely wrong. First of all, you're driving to the office, all the traffic lights are against you. Of course, this irritates you, and because of your irritation, you become more tense and more upright, in your way of handling things, and this leads to mistakes. It could lead to being so furious and going so fast that the police stop you, and so on and so forth. It is this way of battering against life, as it were, that ties it up in knots. And so the secret in Taoism is to get out of one's own way and to learn that this pushing ourselves instead of making us more efficient actually interferes with everything we set about to do. So that was the first part of the book where we talked about certain Taoist principles. And in the second part, we will see the applications. We'll see different ideas and philosophies emerging out of it. And I hope you will continue listening and you'll join me the next time as well. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.